Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
The pathologist concluded that the death was caused by a deep neck wound, and then the body had been completely drained of blood. The limbs had been cut off. The atlas bone was missing, and the bone, in certain cultures, is believed to have mystical powers.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld, with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
A boy with no name, an unsettling and mysterious crime, a story of determination against the odds. Today we're diving into one of the most haunting, unsolved cases in British criminal history. In September 2001, a child's torso was found floating in the River Thames near Tower Bridge in London. The grim discovery set in motion an investigation which would span continents and cultures. We'll hear from the police commander who oversaw the inquiry, how it pushed the boundaries of forensic science and changed the landscape of human trafficking investigations. Martin, you might have imagined that the shocking discovery of a child's limbless body in the Thames would be major news, but this story broke at a moment when the world was distracted by other events.
When the torso was discovered, it ought to have been a case that kept me busy for several weeks. But this was all about timing. The torso was discovered 10 days after 9/11, the attacks on New York and other parts of America. And although the discovery of the torso merited a brief mention on Sky News and other news outlets, my news editors really weren't interested beyond that. The sad truth in news terms was that few people, especially at that time, really cared about the fate of one small, unidentified little boy. Detectives could get little media coverage for a public appeal for information because we were all obsessed, wall-to-wall coverage in the media of 9/11 and its aftermath. Even a £50,000 reward couldn't persuade anybody to come forward with the kind of early details and clues, information that detectives really wanted. And at the same time, it was deemed to be such a difficult case to even start on. And a senior Met officer advised his bosses at Scotland Yard that it really wasn't worth the time and effort, that it was almost an impossible case to solve. So in terms of news, it was a story that was very slow to move forward. And yet when it did move forward, it became one of the most fascinating and intriguing and darkest crimes that I've ever covered. I went on to accompany a couple of senior Met detectives to South Africa and beyond. And as part of that, they and I met Nelson Mandela, who they persuaded extraordinarily to help them make an appeal for information. We interviewed a witch doctor, and we came to understand that the practice of ritual killing was very much alive and well, even in this day and age.
There's so much to unpick on this story, and I'm looking forward to hearing how the case developed. But take us back to the basics. How was the body discovered?
It was just before 4 p.m. on a Friday, September the 21st, 2001. Aidan Minter, who was a video games brand manager, spotted what he thought was a tailor's dummy floating in the River Thames near Tower Bridge. He was walking up the steps to go across the river. And as he looked closer, he realised, and this must have been a horrible thing to come to terms with, that he was looking at the headless torso of a child, a young boy. He alerted the emergency services, and by the time they were able to respond, the body had been carried upstream by the tide and was eventually recovered 3 bridges along the River Thames by the Globe Theatre.
The Thames throws up around, I think, 50 bodies a year, people who have taken their own lives or perhaps had too much to drink. But this one was chillingly different, wasn't it?
Yes, drunks and suicides in the occasional murder victim are found in the Thames. But this was very different. The torso was headless, limbless, had been mutilated in a way that suggested that something far more sinister than an accident or an everyday crime. And bizarrely, the torso was clothed in a pair of orange shorts that police very quickly identified as a German brand. There really wasn't a lot for detectives to go on.
The pathologist, I think, spent 6 hours on the post-mortem examination. What did the post-mortem reveal?
Well, there were such hideous injuries that I suppose it made sense to look at the possibility that this was a young victim of an accident involving a propeller on a boat, but that was quickly ruled out. The pathologist concluded that the death was caused by a deep neck wound, and then the body had been completely drained of blood, so bizarre from the start. And the pathologist told detectives that he'd seen similar knife wounds before, but only in the ritual killing of an animal. The precision of the cuts to his body indicated that the limbs had been cut off after death. But what was also striking was that the atlas bone, the topmost part of the spine of this little victim, was missing. And the bone, in certain cultures, is believed to have mystical powers, and so its removal pointed again to a ritual killing. So that was a path that detectives looked at initially. Toxicology tests showed that the child had been fed cough mixture not long before his death, indicating that he may have been sedated, or perhaps he was cared for. And if he had been cared for just before his death, why on earth wasn't his family reporting him missing?
There are some horrifying details in that answer to think about, but for the police at the time, there still was very little to go on.
Very little to go on and very little chance of any publicity because, as we've said, it was so soon after 9/11. The body, it was quickly established, had been in the water for up to 10 days, so a lot of potential forensic evidence would have been washed away. The police couldn't even be sure of the child's precise age. They had no crime scene, no witnesses, no forensics. What was left of the little boy didn't match any of the 70 or so missing children that had been reported and were the subject of ongoing appeals. And nobody was reporting him missing. So the case seemed insurmountable. And here's an indicator of what the British detectives were up against. When they asked the FBI for some advice, the FBI said, "Don't bother, this case is unsolvable."
Well, Scotland Yard did bother, and we're joined now by Commander Andy Baker, part of Scotland Yard's Serious Crime Directorate, who was appointed the first lead for all murder investigations in London and oversaw this investigation. Andy, welcome to True Criminals.
Good morning.
One of the first things the police did was give the child a name. Tell us about that and why that was so important, Andy.
I was appointed on the 5th of November to be the first chief officer to lead on murders. And within hours of being appointed that and being made public internally in the Met, I got a phone call from Will O'Reilly, who was the deputy SIO for this particular murder at the time. And he said to me, "We've got a murder of a little boy." And I said, "Well, how old is the murder?" He said, 21st September. I said, "Oh, okay, well, come and see me and give me a briefing." So Will O'Reilly came along, we had a meeting, and he then laid out what had been found on the 21st of September, what had been spotted by Aidan, how they recovered the torso, what it was dressed in. There was no family jumping up and down saying, "What are you doing about our missing child, our lost child, our murdered child?" And Will said to me that the investigation had been going on for something like 4 weeks, and told me that Detective Chief Superintendent had said he had decided he was going to put the case away, which meant that the live investigation would be on hold unless any further information came in and the matter be dealt with. After I had the briefing, I said, "Well, that's not going to happen." In fact, my words were, "That's never going to happen. The murder of a child, how could I turn away Someone loved him. He was someone's child. They may not have known what had happened to him. And we had a duty to investigate as much as we could what happened, who committed it, and give him a decent investigation and a decent outcome, as well as going on to family. Then, as it developed into where we were going, we were picking up the cultural issues that were going on. We were getting some newspaper articles, and it was really on the periphery of mainstream TV or broadsheet. And one was in a newspaper that just had Torso Boy, voodoo murder in the Thames. And people referring to this little boy as Torso Boy.
It was the Thames Torso case.
The Thames Torso case, as you quite rightly say. We didn't have a name for him. We had nothing. We didn't have a family. We didn't have where he lived. I said, guys, we need to think about a name for the boy. Will O'Reilly was there. John Azar was there, our lay advisor, who was Ghanaian background. Kate Campbell was there. Ray Feisch was there. There was about 7 of us in the room. It was all minuted. And I said, any ideas? And we came up with, well, what about John Doe? And I said, no, not John Doe. That's too American. Someone said, can't we name him after the person who found him, which was Aidan? And I said, no, because if this goes on, that person who contacted police when he saw what he thought was a torso would live with that for a long time. He's going to live with this for the rest of his life anyway. What about after the SIO? And I said, well, no, I don't think, as with Aidan, William, it would be the wrong thing as well. And they said, well, how about where he was found? And I said, well, the Globe is William again, and that would be linked in with William. And then someone said, what about Kofi? Because Kofi means Friday. Kofi Annan was then the General Secretary of the UN, and got close to naming him Kofi. But then I thought about it long and hard. In this meeting went on for a couple of hours, and I said, well, it sounds good, but Kofi is actually a Ghanaian name, and we don't know if the child was Ghanaian. So people will be fixed on that once they hear that name, and we'll put him to a particular country rather than having an open mind. And I said, and Kofi's very close to coffee. And you can just imagine some people misusing that name, even though the Metropolitan Police have been called institutionally racist. Some people then started saying, oh, they've even called a kid coffee. We got it wrong again. So I said, look, take time out. Let's think about it. And I think you know the story, Martin. It is absolutely true. I woke up in the middle of the night saying the name Adam. And I thought about this long and hard before I called the next goal group, which was the following Monday as it was. So it was over that weekend in mid-December. And my thinking was, Adam had no religious background. It was first man, had no link to any particular part of the world. We were told, we were getting pretty firm on this was a ritual murder by then, as a result of what Mike Heath has said, the pathologist as well. That was a springboard for the ritualism or ritual at the time. And if we were going to get more, then this sounds awful, but it at least means that we could date him. He would have been Adam September 01. And if we'd had another boy, it could have been Adam whatever month and the year. If we'd had a girl, it would have been Eve and the month and the year. So rather than John Doe, Jane Doe, we gave it that. And we called a press conference. And I think you can still see it online where I say, look, we've decided to call the boy Adam. And as we have no family or community, the Metropolitan Police will be his family and the people in London will be his community. So trying to personalise him a bit, trying to get interest, because as you said in the opening, September 11 was everything, and rightly so.
When I read that you'd called him Adam, it choked me up, really. I think you realised he was a little boy. He wasn't a torso. He was a little boy, and he's somebody's little boy, and had obviously suffered a dreadful fate, but you didn't have a lot to go on.
There was no family in the suspicious eye of the police under investigation. We didn't know who this boy was. He was a black boy. He'd been drained of all blood. He'd been inverted. He was given Fulcadine, which is part of cough mixture, and this is the bit that causes drowsiness. So he was given this cough medicine, whether it was to make him drowsy or to deal with a cough, we will never know. But apart from being decapitated, he also had his limbs cut off at the joins, both arms, both legs. His genitalia was still intact.
Can I ask you about DNA? Because the one identifiable means you had was Adam's DNA. You needed something to compare it with, of course. But this investigation, for the first time, as far as we know, looked at the possibility of familial DNA. And can you just explain what Ray Feisch and his team did? They started to look on the fledgling DNA database in those days for somebody who could be Adam's parents.
Yeah.
On the basis that we all share some traits in our DNA with our parents. That was one way of, potentially at least, of trying to identify him.
Yeah, the DNA database started in the 90s, and it was really, it's a bit of a history lesson. The first case based on DNA was back in the late 80s. It was a rape case in Leicestershire. And basically, the rapists, they were able to compare his DNA that was found with the victim on the DNA they extracted from him. So you had the two comparisons. The DNA database was predominantly made up with volunteers from the police service who gave their DNA, and that was for research only. But the criminal database was only from criminals.
People have been charged.
People in charge and convicted of criminal offences. So it wasn't a national DNA database. We do not have that. To this day, we still do not have that. Even though most people have their DNA taken at, nearly everyone has their DNA taken at birth, but that's for medical reasons or for identification reasons.
But at that time, there were still 750,000 people on that database convicted of crimes. So if one of this victim's parents was on that database, you could potentially, if you went through it all, find a potential link.
Yes,
that might help you identify Adam.
Yes, we did. It's not just your parents, it can be siblings as well. You share DNA with your siblings and with your parents, and a bit more limited, but as you go out, other members of your family.
Yeah, there are similarities. I mean, it's not the same.
Not exactly the same. The only time I think can be exactly the same is when you've got a split egg and there's twins. But
identical twins. Yeah.
But then that's another matter. But the first case based on familial DNA, I think, was on the M3 when someone threw a brick through a lorry driver's window. They got the brick. And whilst the assailant's DNA wasn't on the database, a relative of his was on the database. So we knew that you had this link through DNA. Well, we exhausted that from the national DNA database based on the criminal database. And so Ray came up with, well, we can look at familial DNA, and if we arrest someone, we can obviously compare that, see if Adam was related to them, which became important as we arrested some suspects and persons of interest. Mike Heath,
the pathologist.
Yeah, the pathologist, when he went and did the extraction for the DNA that we needed, that was actually the 5th post-mortem that was performed on Adam. And we found a substance in his lower gut, which was sent off for analysis. And this was made up of 3 things. I think it was carbon, vegetation, and something else. And the vegetation we couldn't identify, and we sent off to Kew Gardens. And the lady there who was undertaking the analysis took time out. She couldn't work out what this small item of vegetation was. She went and got a cup of coffee, and she was looking at the notice board outside the cafeteria and saw something about the Calabar bean, which is a bean, looks like a kidney bean, about the same size, which is grown near the river Calabar in Africa. And one bean will kill an elephant, part of a bean will kill someone, and that was inside Adam. Now, we think that that was part of a concoction that was fed to him, that was cooked up, mixed up, fed to him, and that would stupefy him, which meant that he would... It's a bit like these things you hear when people say they have been operated on, and suddenly they wake up, they're aware they're being operated on, but they can't move, and they're frozen. They can't shout out. So we were told that the Calabar bean effect would have been on Adam, that he would have been unable to move but aware of what was going on.
Paralysed.
I'm not sure if paralysed is the right word, but he was aware of everything that was going on around him but could not respond to it. Couldn't move, couldn't scream out, or could scream if not too much had been given to him. So basically your movement was stopped, which was important as we learn more about ritual and ritualism, because part of this is that you invert him in order to strain him off his blood. And we were told, once we had this information, and we went back to, first of all, Mike Heath, a pathologist, but then to a South African pathologist who had been experienced in these types of murders. And he said, well, they would have inverted him so that his head was lower than his feet, so his blood would have flowed down to his head. They would have killed him by inserting the scalpel, the knife, into his neck. and then drained him of all blood. And then limbs would have been carefully removed for purpose.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com. Andy, with few leads in Britain, it sounds like the investigation did then start to look outside the UK at the possibility of perhaps a ritual killing suggested by post-mortem. And I think you, Martin, accompanied Andy, didn't you, to South Africa to look at phenomenons of things like muti murders in which victims are killed for their body parts so that they can cure illness and things like that.
Tell us about South Africa.
Well, what happened was Mike Heath, the pathologist, said, this looks like a ritual murder, but where these occur more anywhere in the world is in Africa. So we undertook some research and we identified a pathologist over there called Hendrik Schultz. And we made contact with him, and as it happened, his father lived in London and he was visiting his father, and we asked him to come in and have a chat with us. And when we gave him the detail of what happened to Adam, he said, yeah, it looks like a ritual murder. It looks very similar to the many that I've had to undertake a pathology on in Africa.
A muti murder?
He said a muti murder at the time.
And let's just be clear, muti is the Zulu word for medicine. And there is a cultural practice, particularly in South Africa, where people believe culturally that all sorts of ailments can be cured by the ingestion of plants or animal parts, or in extreme cases of severe illness, the ingestion of human parts, which leads to a culture of muti murders, the harvesting of body parts to be used as medicine to cure the living.
Yeah.
That's essentially what we're talking about.
That's essentially what we're talking about. It's all about what you believe.
And you thought that Adam possibly was the victim of a muti murder. His organs were harvested to help cure somebody.
Well, his head and limbs were harvested. His torso was intact, so his main organs other than his brain, eyes, etc. But we were told that muti is medicine, but it could also be used in sending off someone well. So if someone's going off to university, you may pulp up a part of a brain. Feed it to them. It could be used, anything.
It could be used for good fortune, not
good
just
fortune,
curing.
Good fortune. It could also be used for bad. So if you wanted to cast a spell on someone, and we found this out, in South Africa, rather than witch doctors, they were called sangomas. And you had good sangomas, and we met one called Credo Mutwa when we went over, and you were there, Martin. And you could have bad ones that obviously bring evil spirits. And this is all about what people believe. You know, it's a form of religion. And if people think about the film Live and Let Die and voodoo and juju, it's all linked with that kind of thought process and belief process. So we were told by Hendrik that he's seen this in South Africa as part of a kind of muti murder.
So I came with you to see the South African police, and I can't get out of my mind that morning with the South African police unit where they gave us a lesson in the aftermath of muti murders. Remind me the sort of things we looked at.
Well, if you remember, it started off, we should say that the South African police force is the only police force in the world, the only country in the world that has a ritual unit that deals with ritualistic murders and crimes. And the superintendent in charge of that unit was called Gerard Labuschagne. And we met Gerard. What we had done, we'd been in a gold group, we'd had the information about muti murder, and someone said, we had the information from Hendrik Schultz, and someone said, well, we could possibly make an appeal. And I said, well, that's a great idea, but we need to find out about these cultures as well. So we try to combine that, and we'll come back to the appeal in a minute. But We decided to go over there. Gerard showed us some of the photographs of what they've found in South Africa. And I've seen a lot of dead bodies, victims of murder, victims of disaster, victims of road accidents, victims under trains. But some of the images we saw there, we had people that had their limbs cut off in a certain way, their eyes gouged out, the thorax or the throat taken. And we were told this would be taken for someone to be a good public speaker. So the Muti was being, just like many things, it was strained and weaved away from that tradition of just pure medicine as to something about belief. The heart would be taken if someone wanted someone else to fall in love with them.
And sometimes the people they were taking these from were still alive, weren't they?
Well, we were told that the idea in some factors of the people that perform these evil things would be to waken up the spirits, particularly so when it came to juju. But with Muti, it was taken from them when they were alive, so that they could scream out to the ancestors and the gods.
The spirits of their ancestors needed to hear their screams.
And needed to hear their cry for help. And so it would waken up the spirits in order to bless whatever organs or body parts were taken. And it's not just human. As you said earlier on, it could be vegetation, it could be animals. But these photographs that we were shown by Gerard and his small team, it was only a team of 4, really did open our eyes. So much so, we said it'd be interesting to see a little bit more. We went, if you remember, to the motorway in Joburg, and they're underneath the motorway, the Muti market, underneath the elevated part of the motorway in Joburg.
How could I forget that?
We went in and you saw animals from giraffes, elephants, parts that were being sold in an open market for the purposes of Muti.
No human body parts on sale?
No, but if you recall, when Will and I did ask about that, we were told by Gerard it would not be on display for the obvious reasons, but if you were trusted and you were asked, they could possibly have them under the counter, so to speak.
So at this point, you're getting to the stage where you think it perhaps isn't a Muti murder, but ritual may have been involved. And that's when you consulted the Sangoma, isn't it? Or perhaps, as we might have said, used to call them witch doctors.
I think that Credo Mutwa would have been upset if you called him a witch doctor. He preferred the Sangoma, but they're given different names all around the world. And this kind of belief isn't just in sub-Saharan Africa. This actually goes globally because of the diaspora of people from that part of the world anyway.
And what did he reveal? What did he say?
Well, when we went in, we were a bit... Let's see what goes here. And if you remember, Martin, you weren't allowed to come in,
Well... The idea...
You waited at the gate, didn't you, for a while?
The idea of Scotland Yard detectives consulting a witch doctor in South Africa was bizarre at the very least. And I can only imagine there was a bit of leg pulling from your colleagues back at Scotland Yard headquarters.
There was, and I'm pretty sure there were a few cartoons made up as well. But we were clutching at straws. We didn't understand the culture. We had... on sound, strong advice from Hendrik Schultz and others, that he was the South African pathologist, that this does occur. Gerard Lapasachny, a very able police officer in South Africa, and his team told us this went on. So when he said, look, do you want to meet a Sangoma? We said, OK. And he said, well, the best one, and he said, I go to, is Credo Mutwa. And you can look him up online. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but Credo, we walked in, and I was even more suspicious when we walked in. And he was dressed head to toe in a kind of dress, tied at the waist. He was quite, he wasn't a tall man, but he was a big man. And he had, and I can only describe it, and I think I described it at the time as something like a tea towel over his head. And he sat in front of a bookcase, and the bookcase had loads of books in it that you would expect to see from a Sangoma around faith, around religion, and around cultures. But in front of one, I could see one of those little footballers with a wobbly head. And I thought, where have they brought us?
But Credo did give you some
He was
interesting
brilliant.
insight.
He was brilliant.
What did he say about possibly this being a ritual sacrifice to a water deity? And what did he tell you this could all be? And the significance of the little boy's red shorts, too.
Yeah, the orange shorts, orange or red. And what he said was, this isn't from what you would know as Muti. This is from people further north, and he pointed further north, up towards further parts of Africa. These will be evil men, and they would be doing this for juju, which was another word for voodoo. And he said the orange shorts, he said, they reflect the goddess Ocean. Ocean is a goddess for water, which came together with, obviously, Adam having been deposited in the River Thames. So when he was telling us about this, all the things that we had hypothesised, been told, relied on, it was like a drawing that was being coloured in for us. We didn't give him a full briefing, yet he came back with things that we had heard elsewhere. So Will and I came out, and as we were walking the 200 yards or so from the house to the gate where Martin and others, I said, people aren't going to believe us that what we've heard, but he's just said exactly what goes on. This isn't someone where he got a crystal ball out and he said, oh, well, I can see in this ball. He actually said, these are the facts and these are what I know. This happens up in places like Nigeria.
He was pivotal in redirecting you to West Africa. But before you went to West Africa, you had another big mission in Johannesburg. Tell us about that, because that was another extraordinary day, your meeting with Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, well, what happened was, again, it was in one of the gold groups, and it was the exhibits officer, Mark Ham, who we were just talking about, look, September 11 was still fresh in the minds. There was the manhunt going on for Bin Laden and everything else around what had happened there. There was fear of other things coming along. And we'd raised the interest of the media, and thank you, Martin, you were one of those in the TV world, but there were others in the printed world, Jeff Edwards, who followed the story. And in fact, when we put up the £50,000 reward, it was matched as well. Another newspaper said that they were going to match that and help us. So it was important that we worked closely with the media, controlled them so they didn't run away with Voodoo Boy and Juju, and new commander in charge of murder goes and speaks to some witch doctor in Africa. That didn't happen.
Well, it was a gamble employing or inviting people like me to come with you, because you could have gone to South Africa and eventually to West Africa and spent an awful lot of money and got nowhere, and that would have been quite embarrassing.
Well, I was prepared to take that walk.
And it harks back to the relationship that used to exist between detectives and crime reporters, and we could spend another hour talking about how that
and perhaps we should do one
relationship-
day, because I think that's an important story to tell.
But this was a shining example of how detectives and the media worked very, very closely together and produced results.
But there were parameters. I'll just say very quickly, if I asked you not to say something or do something, or if you would wait at the gate when we went to see Credo, you abided with that. Of course, we would talk about it afterwards, perhaps over a drink, perhaps not. But let's just get back to what happened. So Mark Ham said, well, why don't we go for a big appeal? We said, well, who's the best person to make an appeal? And he jokingly said, Nelson Mandela. We all looked at each other and I thought, why not? So we said to Hendrik Schultz, and he actually came into one of the gold groups as well to give us all this advice. And he said, well, why not? So we wrote to a lady called Zelda, who was Nelson Mandela's personal assistant, and we met her eventually. And she wrote back and said, Madiba, which is what they referred to Nelson Mandela in South Africa as, which means it's a respect of like uncle. Madiba, he would see you. So we built all this into this one trip. You mentioned about cost. As it happens, it wasn't an expensive investigation compared to many others, because a lot of people gave their work, certainly on the forensic side, pro bono. But we went over to Africa and I said, well, rather than just going out and finding about the culture, meeting with Gerard Labuschagne, we didn't know about Credo much at the time, but seeing what they experience and everything else, we got invited to go and have an audience with Nelson Mandela. So we carefully thought through how best to use this valuable resource and his time as well. Who would you have sitting at a meal with 10 people? I think he'd be in everyone's first three. So we went along to see Mr. Mandela. We first met Zelda. We went to his official home in Joburg, and we went in to brief him, and he didn't come in straight away. And we met Zelda. She was a woman in her 40s, white woman, really helpful. She didn't say, you can say this, you can't say that. All she did say was, Madiba, if he goes to fall, please don't grab him. He doesn't want to be grabbed. That's pretty difficult to do when someone stumbles, you naturally do, because it did happen. And I did put my arm out and grab his arm. That was later on in the background as we're walking to and from the press conference. But he came in, and I don't know if you really want to hear this, but he came in and he had a bit of toothpaste on his chin, and he came in and he said hello. And Zelda said, oh, Madiba, you got something on? And she took out this handkerchief that she'd obviously used, licked it and wiped the toothpaste. And then we're thinking, this is Nelson Mandela. And there was Will O'Reilly, Kate Campbell, myself, and the ambassador from South Africa, British ambassador from South Africa. He sat down, we briefed him for about 2 hours with tea and coffee.
He listened to 2 hours of a
around
briefing.
2 hours.
That's
We met him around 8:30. I think the press conference was about 11. It might have been even longer than that. We got there about 8:30. So
Yeah, I was sitting sweltering outside.
it was a really hot
in
day.
the Joburg sun while you were spending 2 hours with him.
How did he react, Andy, when you started to explain the story?
He kept saying terrible crime, terrible, brings terrible name on our people, terrible crime. That's all he kept saying. So we gave him the full briefing, and we went out and did a press conference.
With Mandela?
With Mandela. So Mandela sat in the middle, I sat next to him. The ambassador sat the other side of him, British ambassador, Will O'Reilly and Kate Campbell. I've done lots of press conferences, whether on the streets or controlled in, within a room environment. But it's the most I've ever seen. You may remember it from when Alan Titchmarsh, that ground force team, went and did the garden. Well, it was a little cobbled road about 12, 15 foot across. We were one side with a table, 5 of us, and across the other side was literally a bank of about 90 members of the press. So you had people sitting down on the cobblestone step, you had people kneeling behind them, you had people standing behind them, you had people on chairs behind them. And obviously I could spot Martin and others there. And we spoke, he made the appeal, and the whole idea was to get an appeal that we could appeal to Africa.
He made a very impassioned and a long, detailed appeal for information. And of course, when Mandela spoke, people around the world listened. It was exactly what you wanted, more than you probably would have expected.
It was a lot more than we expected. It was also saying we're watching you and we're preventing this. And we were told by a number of people that our actions in not putting the case away, in making sure that we're investigating, and keep banging on doors and rattling cages and upsetting people if we needed to, or just asking the question, that we were stopping other people that had these beliefs from committing more crimes of that vein.
So, Andy, you'd arranged the most extraordinary appeal for information and justice from Nelson Mandela. You'd found out much more in South Africa about ritual killing and new leads about where to look next. We'll explore what happened and how the investigation got ever closer to the truth, identifying suspects in our next episode. Join us then. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our producer is Russell Barnes, with audio production by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.